What's up, guys? Alexander here, Date Psychology. So, what should we talk about today? This comes up often, this idea that the more attractive a man is, the more sexual partners he will have had. And certainly this is an understandable belief, right? It's completely intuitive in a sense, because we know that attractiveness functions kind of like a gate for romantic success, for sexual success, right? You do have to at least meet some sort of threshold of physical attractiveness and also behavioral attractiveness to even have sex at all. So people tend to assume that someone who is highly attractive, a highly desirable partner, which might be physically attractive or it could be behaviorally, realistically, it's going to be some combination of the two, is going to have had many sexual partners. And it's understandable that belief, right, where that might come from, because certainly someone who is in kind of that top tier of attractiveness may have more opportunities, right? They may have the ability to have more sexual partners, but does that actually translate into having more sexual partners? Are the most attractive men the most promiscuous men, that sort of a thing? Well, I'll go through some papers today. We will look at those. I posted about this on social media. There were some comments. I'll go through some of those also, because I thought this was an interesting topic, kind of interesting to look at and maybe clear some of these things up. So first paper we want to look at here, this is from Peter Jonassen, evolutionary psychologist, pretty well known. It's called The Mediation Hypothesis to Account for the Sex Difference in Reported Number of Sexual Partners. So this is a paper about why do we see, and I've made videos on this in the past, why do we see differences in sexual partner reports and surveys, right? Why do men on average say they've had, 6, and women on average say they have 4, for example? So I'm not going to go a lot into that. Here's another paper. I actually haven't talked about this. I'm not going to talk about those results here either. Well, I am actually. I'm going to talk about some of them. But the relevant ones kind of to this video, and they do kind of intersect. So we will see going forward. What are we looking at? The main results from this paper, okay? This was an earlier paper from 2008, and there's been many since then. So this was one of the first ones to look at what has been called secret and swagger since then, right? The idea that men exaggerate sexual partners while women reduce. And this is looking specifically at the exaggeration. And why might that be? Well, the main finding is that it's related to status. It's basically intersexual status competition or signaling between men. A man who has a lot of sexual partners signals to other men in intersexual competition, which might not always be competition for mates, right? It might just be status jockeying, that he is more valuable, that he is more attractive. How do you know? Well, women find him more attractive. How do you know? Because he's had sex with a lot of women, right? So it signals this to other men. And it doesn't have this effect for women in the results of this. But the effect is pretty large for men. I think it was a 0.6 Cohen's D, the difference. So it is a status cue for men to have sex with a lot of women. And I think this has filtered into popular culture as far as the idea that having sex with a lot of women is attractive or desirable to women. Why? Because men see it that way in other men. Does that make it so for women? Well, we will kind of look and find out. So, 2 conditions here. They had men that had 5 sexual partners and 50. And men rated the men in the 50 group, right, the maximum number of sexual partners, as the most prestigious. So you have basically an effect at the very large end, right? Few people have had that many sexual partners based on all of the representative data, that men who have had a large number of sexual partners have the most status, the most prestige in that sense. Let's look at the next slide. So men also, in the results, they rated women that had a higher sexual partner count, women in the 50 group, right, as more desirable for short-term sex. Why is that? Probably because they view them as more accessible for short-term sex, right? Kind of like, yeah, they probably will have sex with me since they've had sex with 50 people already. So that is why a woman might be seen more desirable short-term. And of course, men, as you might expect, rated women that had 50 partners less desirable as long-term mates. So that's something I think that is intuitive, that most people are going to know. It's come out in more recent research, that sort of a thing. So what else do we see? And I think this is where people get kind of riled up about it. Women rated men with a low partner count in the 5 group as more desirable for a long-term relationship. And this effect is even larger than men rating women, right? We have a Cohen's d of 0.3. So, in psychology, about the average, it's about a small, medium effect. And that's something that I think surprises a lot of people. This idea that women would prefer a man who has not had sex with 50 people, but who has had sex with 5 people. And this is specifically when assessing a man for a long-term relationship, right? For short-term relationships, there was a non-significant difference for the man who had 50 partners, but not significant, right? So you say it's no difference or whatever. So why might that be? Well, let's go forward and look at some additional research right now, okay? Here is another paper. This is a more recent one by Steve Stewart Williams. Andrew Thomas, also evolutionary psychologist, is an author on this one. They also looked at when would a man and a woman decline to enter a short-term sexual relationship or a long-term relationship, or more specifically, more accurately, what is the most desirable number of sexual partners? And for both long and short-term sexual partners, for both men and for women, it's about 3 to 7. It's pretty low. It's not on the very high end of things, even for short-term sexual relationships. You do see at the beginning having 0 partners, right? That's also a little bit lower. So, having no sexual partners was not rated the most attractive, not for men and not for women either, which might be surprising given some of the discourse out there on, you want a virgin and all of that. Not what most men said, nor what most women said. This is interesting because we see the same trend for short and long-term relationships. Why might that be? Well, as I've discussed in the past, it's probably because there's very few actual short-term strategists out there that are specifically seeking that. Short-term sex, particularly for women, might be kind of an entry point or a jump point into a long-term relationship. So many of the traits, and this is consistent in the research as well, that are assessed for long-term mate value are also assessed for short-term mate value. Physical attractiveness, of course, is kind of up there as far as what someone wants in both a long-term and a short-term mate, but then so are different behavioral traits and even things like status and resources. Highly valued in short-term mating. Why might that be? We tend to think of short-term mating as related to attractiveness, seeking good genes, but where we actually see a lot of short-term mating, particularly in a modern environment, is resource extraction, right? So what's an example of short-term mating? Sex work, and this is entirely based on resources. So this is something you even see in primates, right? In our close ape ancestors, the chimpanzees, they will trade pieces of meat for sex. They will go back and forth, like, here's a piece of meat, the woman will turn around, or I should say the female chimpanzee will turn around, and they will do a little bit of exchange. So there, even in these short-term contexts in non-human primates, we see an exchange of resources. And of course, resources are valued in long-term partners as well. So whatever. The point is that you see similar preferences for long and short-term. You see a similar pattern here. And you see something that's kind of similar for men and women as well, that high partner counts, not really preferred. So let's go to the next slide. When I posted the original paper, of course, there's always people that ask, this is a survey, this is people stating their preferences. And we know that stated preferences do not always match up with revealed behavior, right? That's something that's kind of seen in speed dating studies. People rate attractiveness a little bit lower, but attractiveness often emerges as the top variable that determines who gets picked for a second date. So if someone says, I don't want someone with a lot of partners, but they actually do have sex with someone with a lot of partners, you might see kind of a mismatch, right, of the stated and the revealed preferences. At the same time, it's important not to dismiss stated preferences out of hand, because stated preferences still are robust predictors of who gets picked, right? People, they might say, I don't value attractiveness that much, it's that much, but they really do value it up here. But they still will tell you, attractiveness matters. They might say, they might get it wrong how much something matters, but typically the direction of the effect, when people say like, I like something or I don't, they usually do get that right, okay? So it might be, that people don't care that much about past partner count, even if it is kind of a net negative, right? It's probably not the case that it is restricting a lot of people from relationships. And to kind of get to the bottom of that, this up here is from some of the research that I did. And I asked people, have you ever stopped actually dating someone when you found out their body count? And here we see 9.7% of men, 6.6% of women said yes. Okay. I also asked, have you been broken up with? Okay. So smaller percentage here said that. So maybe some people were broken up with us over this and they didn't actually know, right? So 2.5% of men and 3.6% of women. So this doesn't seem to occur that often, probably because most people don't have excessively large body counts, contrary to popular promiscuity narratives out there. But it happens at a rate for men and women that's kind of similar. It's not like we see this huge discrepancy. It does happen more with women, that women are less likely to stop dating a man over it, right? We do see some sex differences here, but not huge, right? Who has terminated a committed relationship? Someone that they were already in a committed relationship with, 4.47% of men, 2.26. So this is not a stated preference, right? This does rely on people to report accurately, but it's not asking like, hey, how much do you care? It's saying, what have you done? Actual behaviors, right? So what else looking at this? I also asked individuals, and I have 2 articles on this data that I collected up on the website. So go to the website, check those out. I asked who asks and who knows, because that can also kind of indicate like, is it that important to you if you ask, right? Does it matter that much? So most women and most men, the same percentage, say that they do actually ask, how many past partners have you had sex with, of a romantic partner or date or whatever. And that would also indicate, maybe it kind of matters to some people at least enough to ask. A pretty substantial chunk don't ask at all, which you could interpret as like they don't want to know, or you could interpret it as they don't even care. So they don't care enough to ask is probably what I would take that as. So I'm going to read a quotation from the original paper here by Jonason that we went over. And this is about inferring the status of other men. So, while the data clearly show that women prefer men with fewer sexual partners, men may use the fact that another man has had many sexual partners as an indirect means of assessing status and attractiveness to women. Clearly, this sexually successful man must have something that other men do not in order to be more successful. So this is important, that this partner count serves as a status cue to other men, but it's not something that women see as attractive. Let's look at the next slide. This is about the signals of promiscuity to women. So we see that women say that they do not want someone with a large partner count, especially in a long-term relationship context. This isn't difficult to understand from the evolutionary perspective. And why is that? Because one of the main things women look for in a long-term relationship, a committed relationship, is commitment, right? Someone that's going to be faithful to you, that's going to commit, that's going to be loyal, that's going to invest in you, and very importantly, not invest in relationships outside of the current one. So what do we know about promiscuity, right? It is associated with infidelity, right? It's associated with other behaviors, related to low relationship satisfaction. So especially if someone is familiar with the psychological literature, if they hear that someone has had a lot of sexual partners, it might be a red flag, and maybe it should be. It should be something that, makes you think twice, like, hey, what's going on here? We talk about pair bonding, and this is, I've written about this, again, see the website. The idea that, having a lot of sex ruins someone's ability to pair bond. But the relationship is probably in the opposite direction. It's probably the case that some people accumulate many sexual partners, men and women both, because they're unable to form lasting relationships and lasting bonds. So if you hear that a man or a woman has had many sexual partners, it might raise questions like, okay, is this someone who cheats? Is this someone who can't stay in a relationship? They got something going on that, they're able to make it past the gate of attractiveness, but they can't commit. Do they have problematic relationships? Do they have issues with attachment, right? Are they avoidantly attached, for example? Many things like that. Do they have personality disorders? Those all kind of come up, and I think those aren't things that are explicit in someone's mind unless they are a psychologist who thinks about things like this. But it is something that is implicit, particularly from the evolutionary perspective, the desire for someone who will commit and invest and be loyal, because human beings are mostly a monogamous species, right? A long-term pair bonding species, not permanently, but serially, right? Serial monogamy. I've said it a million times already. So let's see the next one. We're going to look at some more research. This is a meta-analysis that I did, and this is also in an article on the website. This is the relationship between physical attractiveness and sexual partner count. If you have not interpreted a forest plot like this, okay, look at the squares. They show the direction of the effect and the size of the effect, okay? If the error bars cross the line, no effect, whatever. And the little diamond at the bottom is basically the total, what all of the studies tell you, okay? This gives us a Hedges G of 0.14, so it's small. It's a very small effect. So in other words, the relationship between physical attractiveness and lifetime number of sexual partners, it's pretty low, which might surprise a lot of people. But I think I'm the first one to do this, to look at this, and and you can see the effect as well across all of these other studies, right? It's not just something produced at the end. There is a consistent association, pretty much, right? That you do see a positive association between physical attractiveness and sexual partner counts, but it's a small association. And if you look at the article that I have up here, there are many things that predict sexual partner count with more strongly than physical attractiveness. I've gone through a lot of these. So it's not that like it doesn't matter at all, there's no relationship. That would also be kind of weird, wouldn't it? Knowing that physical attractiveness functions as a gate, knowing that people who are very attractive are desirable as sexual partners, as relationship partners, romantically, long-term as well, all of that. It would be really weird if you found no relationship at all. But there's reasons that this is a small relationship, and I will try to go into some of these going forward. The meta-analysis I did, physical attractiveness, but as I mentioned, there's a lot that goes into attractiveness beyond what is just physical, and many of these things are better predictors of sexual partner count. And some examples of that, okay, social dominance is one. You have correlations 0.3 or something like that. Athletic participation was a big one that I came across in a few studies. Different personality traits predict more sexual partners. Extroversion in the Big Five, for example. The dark triad, personality construct, which of course consistently predicts having more sexual partners. The list goes on and on. I'm not going to list everything, but it's important to understand that people's choices determine how many people they're going to have sex with, right? It's not just like you're hot, so people fall in your lap and you're going to have sex with them no matter what. No. People put themselves into situations to have many sexual partners or not, right? They put themselves into situations to have sex outside of a relationship or not. They put themselves into monogamous relationships where they don't have sex for a long period, or with just one person, I should say. Whereas if you are putting yourself on Tinder and like chasing tail nonstop every day, yeah, you're going to have more sexual partners. Even if you look exactly the same as the other guy, that's behavioral, that's not physical. Although, I'm not saying there's not a physical component of it. You do, as I mentioned, you got to pass the threshold, right? You got to pass the bar to even make it. But a lot of people do. And when they do, their behavior can be very different, and that can determine different outcomes. So keep that in mind. Let's look at some of the comments when I posted this, because it's kind of what made me think of it. This is a guy, he talked to him on there sometimes. He's a good guy. So he said, what data? The fact that a man has more sexual partners is the axiomatic proof women prefer that man over other men in terms of sexual choice. Sure, in some abstract hypothetical sense, they may prefer less partners, but the more experienced man is more attractive. So I kind of hinted at why we should not actually expect this to be the case, right? Why we've gone over enough data to kind of indicate, okay, stated preferences don't always indicate that, the most experienced man, or I should say the man who's had the most sex, is the most attractive. Revealed preferences show women ending relationships over this, and we don't see a strong relationship again between physical attractiveness and having a lot of sexual partners either. So, that's what data, basically. There's pretty substantial data that indicates, that it's not just a linear relationship like hotter guy, more sex. It's a little bit more complex than that. Think about it this way. I kind of hinted at this. Imagine two men, okay? Imagine that they're twins or whatever. They look the same. They have an equal level of attractiveness. But one is a long-term strategist, right? RK life history strategy, whatever you want to call it. He has a much stronger orientation toward monogamy, right? He scores low in sociosexuality. The other man, his evil twin or his good twin, or however you want to look at it, okay? So he is a short-term strategist, right? I guess the R selected or K, I forget. And he has very high sociosexuality. He's in a poly relationship, let's say, and he's doing a bunch of other stuff, right? He's never had a long-term relationship. He just goes on Tinder every night, and he's pretty attractive, and so he has a lot of casual sex, and he goes out to bars every night and has sex with strangers, so forth, okay? The first man got married when he was 20 and has been married for 20 years. So, does that mean that the short-term strategist is more attractive to women than the long-term strategist? Well, physically, not necessarily, right? We have kind of indicated that they look the same, right? They're kind of twins. Behaviorally, are they more attractive? There are many reasons to guess perhaps not, but their behavior is certainly different. And that does raise questions as to what extent is having a lot of sex a measure of attractiveness. They've simply made different decisions in their life, right? One of them he chose to have sex with one woman, and that's it. And the other man has decided to have sex with a bunch of women. Does that mean women like the second man more? Women might actually like the first man just as much or more, right? But they don't have access to him through his decisions. It's basically as simple as that. And I think, going on to the next slide, I think this kind of describes why we don't necessarily see a strong relationship between attractiveness and sexual partner count. Because someone can be attractive, but what do most people do? As I've mentioned in the past, they form relationships, and the relationship, it can last a year, or it can last 10 years, or 6 months, or 5 years. But if you are spending a long time in a monogamous relationship, you're limiting yourself to sex with one person, basically. That's, as simple as that goes. So it's not the case, let's look at this slide. It's not the case that men who limit themselves to monogamous relationships are less attractive. And that includes physical attractiveness, measures of physical attractiveness, as well as measures of behavioral attractiveness, status, and that sort of thing. So what do we know? And this is also in one of my data sets, but you can see this in past research as well. So I found that married men, they had fewer partners on average at 30 plus, okay? And then the other things are just kind of general associations across the research for men who are married. They tend to be higher in physical attractiveness than single men. They have a higher income, higher education level, they're taller on average. Additionally, less likely to be obese. I didn't include that in the slide. There are a lot of indications that men in monogamous relationships are actually more attractive than single men. So it's not the case that men who limit themselves to one sexual partner are less valuable as a mate. If you look at some kind of measurement across the board of like mate value, if it's like income or whatever, nor that they're less attractive or anything like that. And certainly there's a lot of narrative out there, right? The idea that men would not get married at all if they didn't have to access sex, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Highly attractive men tend to pair up with attractive women as well. We see assortative mating for physical attractiveness. We know that there is a curvilinear relationship for women between sexual partners and attractiveness. So what does that mean? The least attractive women have fewer sexual partners. The most attractive women have fewer sexual partners. But women kind of in the middle have a little bit more on average. And why is that? Probably because sex is being used as a mate retention strategy to enter a long-term relationship. Women who are very low in attractiveness may not even be able to access that at all. Contrary to Tinder memes or whatever that's like, oh, you can upload the pig girl and she's going to have sex with 1 billion people. Doesn't seem to actually be shown in the data. But women who do pass that bar, who are able to attract men who are enough, might find men that will have sex with them, but maybe are not attractive enough to get married, to have a committed relationship. They might go through more partners in that sense. Whereas women who are very high in attractiveness, they have a much broader range right? They also tend to have much higher standards. This was a quotation from David Buss in a recent paper. He said, highly attractive women want the full package, basically. So they're more demanding when it comes to the physical appearance of the man, right? You see assortative mating. But they also tend to want other things, which includes, things like income status, but also certain behaviors, right? If you have more access to more individuals, you can be more choosy in a partner in that sense, which actually seems to reduce promiscuity in women as opposed to the other way around. Let's look at the next slide. Why do we see this? As I mentioned, this is probably simply because being in a long-term relationship will limit your lifetime partner count. Very easy to understand, I think. It's very intuitive. How many people, have you had sex with in the last 5 years? If you've been in a relationship, it's probably one person, right? How many people would you have had sex with if over the last 5 years you went out to a bar every night, dancing, and you just hit Tinder up nonstop? Maybe 2, right? Maybe 10, maybe many, many more. Would that make you more attractive, right? Would that be a sign that you are more desirable to women? No, it wouldn't. That would change pretty much nothing about you, except it would increase your partner count, right? So it probably doesn't matter how much you can pull in that sense, right? It probably doesn't matter how many people you have sex with. It doesn't seem to be a good index of mate value or of, I guess, physical attractiveness, behavioral attractiveness. And I think where this throws some people is they'll think, yeah, but if I'm really low in attractiveness, I'm not having sex with anyone. So how does it not predict that? Okay, so this is probably something that's driven by people, not at the higher end, but people who do pass the bar, right? And that's also why we probably see a small correlation. There probably are people who are very low in attractiveness, completely excluded. But at the same time, people very high in attractiveness who married the cheerleader, have been married for a long time, and they have a partner count that is much lower than it would have been if they were trying. And I think that's really what a lot of this high partner count comes down to. The difference in men who try to accumulate a lot of sexual partners and those who don't. So here's another quote. This was kind of funny, so I put it up. He said, he was responding to one of these. These guys are feminists and inexperienced with women. The rigor of their studies, methodologies is often laughable. So this is a photo of Jonathan. He's actually quite a handsome man. I don't think he has, and he's older in this, but I think he was a man who was actually quite attractive. But anyway, you have a lot of people who are completely anonymous online who'll be like, just making things up, whatever. I thought that was kind of interesting. I wondered when I read this, I wonder if the author of this paper is someone who seems like he would be inexperienced in relationships. He doesn't, actually. Here's another comment. This was about pre-selection. And what is pre-selection? Pre-selection is the idea that women receive signals, typically from other women, but could also be environmental signals of value in a mate. Okay? So if you as a man are valuable to other women will see that and they'll say, other women like him, so I kind of do too. And this is kind of related to what we talked about as number of sexual partners as a status and prestige cue for men, isn't it, right? Men see a man who's had sex with a lot of people, or who has claimed to or whatever, and they say, well, he's got something going on. He's doing something right, even if they don't know what it is. And that's kind of what pre-selection does. So what's important to understand about pre-selection? It has to be kind of hard to fake. So in the research, what do we know about pre-selection? What works? Married men are seen as more attractive on average, even after controlling for the fact that married men are actually more attractive on average. So they've done experiments, I believe, wearing a wedding ring, and you'll see people kind of being approached more. And I think even that's something anecdotally that a lot of men who have been married have even experienced. Like, I wore the wedding ring and now people are approaching me. So that's something that kind of shows up. So it's important to understand that it has to be a hard to fake signal, which means that it can't be something, intuitively like what it sounds like. It can't be something really easy just to make up or pass off as true. Like being married, hard to fake. Being actually in a relationship, right? It's not even just being married. A lot of guys say this also. They'll say, I didn't get any female attention until I was in a relationship, and now all of a sudden I'm getting all of the female attention. It might have changed your behavior subtly in a way that you're like, you're not as focused on women or whatever, or It could be that they know, right? It could be friends of your girlfriend or whatever the case may be, your wife, and that sort of thing. So an important part of this is that pre-selection relies on signals, which means they have to be known. So when we are talking about number of sexual partners, specifically, for something like casual sex, that's usually not something that's known, right? This is something that tends to come up a little bit later down the line. So if you meet a woman on Tinder and you're talking to her for a couple of days, she's probably not going to ask you how many people you had sex with. It doesn't seem to come up that often. And in my data as well, I asked people, when do you ask? It was kind of late down the line. So it's not something that's coming up on a first or a second date. So a lot of people who have sex kind of early in a relationship are having sex with you and they're not ever asking how many partners you had sex with. So there's not even any opportunity for pre-selection, right? Pre-selection probably functions more for long-term mate selection in that sense than for short-term mate selection, right? It's not something that is easily conveyed. It's never been a pickup strategy to tell women like, yeah, I'm having sex with a bunch of people. I've had sex with 50 people or whatever. So in fact, as I understand it, a lot of pickup artists recommend that you do not do that for some reason, and I would have to go back and see why that is. What else do we have going on here? It probably sends the wrong signals to begin with to even work as pre-selection. And why is that? Because women want to know, there is kind of that, okay, he's valued by other women, but that shines through if someone is in a relationship, right? If someone has been married, if they are currently married or whatever the case, if they're able to maintain relationships and invest in someone. It doesn't show up as much if your history is, I have sex with people and then immediately leave, because that's not what most people are looking for. So it is not the correct signal. It doesn't signal high value in that sense. Let's go on to the final slide here. Looking at this, what can we kind of take away? So I think men in a lot of this discourse have kind of been fooled by their own intrasexual status signaling, okay? We've gone over this, that men see other men who have had many sexual partners high status. They're probably more attractive. They're probably doing something right. And that's kind of what we've seen in the comments, right? When someone says, okay, women view men with many partners as being lower in attractiveness, they say, how could that be? It's just completely counter to their own experience. But their own experience is very much how they feel intuitively and evaluate other men in that sense. It's not their own experience insofar as, it's probably not their own experience insofar as actual reactions that they received from women when disclosing a high partner count. Because the reactions you receive from women, if you've had a lot of sexual partners, it's usually not like, oh, that's so great, I love it. I love that you have sex with a lot of people, that you've had a lot of casual sex, and even better if they're strangers and you didn't commit to any of them and all of these things. That's usually not actually something that women like. And it's usually not something that's going to enhance a man's appearance. Now, if you're already on a date and you're talking to a woman and she's already interested in you, and she finds out you've had a lot of sexual partners. Okay, we've seen kind of like most people don't break off a date for that. Not even most men do. So it's probably not going to be something that destroys you. But it's not something that enhances your image, right? It's not image enhancing in that sense, as it is to other men. It's something that is probably on net kind of negative. It raises questions. What's going on here? Why? Why do you have sex with so many people? Has he had a relationship? Has he been able to maintain relationships? Can I trust him? Would he cheat on me? And so on and so forth. What else does this mean across all of the research we've looked at here? Number of sex partners is probably a pretty poor and unreliable signal of male value or physical attractiveness, right? We see small associations with it. We see that men in monogamous relationships tend to be higher in a lot of, high value kind of traits and that sort of thing. And I didn't mention what short-term strategists are associated with, but that tends to be associated with more negative signs of value, okay? One of those tends to be lower income, lower socioeconomic status. Lower intelligence is one that you see, at least in adolescence, right? That lower intelligence on average is associated with earlier sexual debut and having more partners. And it's not like adolescents are having a bunch of partners anyway, but it is kind of one of those things that you see, okay, what else do we see? For example, individuals who have a criminal record, particularly in adolescence up through the late to mid-20s, tend to have more sexual partners on average. At the same time, on average, individuals with a criminal record tend to be less attractive. So you kind of see these strange associations that's like, okay, we have people that are having a lot of sexual partners, but they don't necessarily coincide with all of these other markers. And why is that? Well, a lot of that comes down to kind of behavior, that really behaviors that are, high value in a mate, especially to a woman who's looking for a long-term relationship, are basically not like fuckboy behaviors, right? They're not people who are engaging in really high-risk behavior, a lot of promiscuous casual sex. And yeah, if someone's able to do that, maybe they look okay enough to do it in the first place, right? But so do a lot of other people who aren't. So all something to consider there. Anyway, I hope you guys liked the video. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. I will make another for you very soon.